Alright everyone, so this is the second video associated with Chapter 12. We're going to kind of delve into coping specifically. I know that I mentioned in the previous video I was going to kind of block this out from the rest of the chapter, and the reason being is this lecture in the book, to be honest, doesn't really do this topic justice. Coping strategies in sport and physical activity, we could dedicate an entire course to that. So I wanted to make sure we kind of block it out. I'm not going to talk too specifically about a lot of topics. We're going to talk about how coping can help, what are different types of coping. But ultimately, if you want to know more about this, let me know, and I can kind of point you in the right direction of maybe some other resources that could give you a bit more information or a little bit more depth. So the first thing we need to talk about is really what is coping, and coping is a process of constantly changing cognitive and behavioral efforts to manage specific external or internal demands or conflicts appraised as taxing or exceeding one's resources. So that's kind of busy, right? So what coping really is think back to one of our models where we're placed into a stressful situation and we appraise how stressful that situation is. The first thing where coping comes in is we appraise the situation, and do we have the resources that we could deal with that stress, where we could cope with that stress. Now, if we are in a stressful situation and we believe that, or if we have the resources where we can deal or cope with that situation, then we're effectively dealing with that stress. But there's definitely situations that you can probably think of where athletes or even yourself are placed in situations where there are just too many demands or too many stressors, and it kind of overloads our system. We can't keep up with that amount of stress. So coping talks about all of this. Okay, now there's primarily two different types of coping. We usually say problem-focused and emotion-focused coping strategies. Okay, so problem-focused coping are any strategies or techniques to alter or manage the problems that are causing the stress. So time management, problem solving, that kind of stuff. A lot of times these are structural things with the stressor. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And then there's emotion-focused coping, and this is where we're trying to regulate or just become aware of the emotional responses to the stressor that or to the event that are causing some kind of stress. So often with this type of coping, we'll deal with our emotions through relaxation, meditation, some of the topics that we've actually already covered. So here are some examples of problem-focused coping, some strategies that are really key to this process. That's going to be information gathering, so trying to figure out what's causing the stress, what again, structural elements of the stressor or event are causing stress. Looking at your pre-competition and competition plans, that's usually a great way of being able to come up with a routine or a habit that'll help you deal with any stressors that might come up. Coming up with a solid goal structure or goal setting framework helps deal with structural elements. Time management skills, problem solving, that kind of goes without saying. Increasing effort usually helps to some degree, but this one's kind of tricky because we can definitely think of times where maybe we as athletes or athletes we've seen out playing really try a lot harder, but ultimately it doesn't affect the outcome, or it's not going to affect the stressor. So increasing effort's kind of a tricky one. Self-talk is definitely something that can help you out, but again, that's more of an emotion-focused strategy. If there is a negative thought that's in your head, clearly using self-talk would help you cope with that problem. And then there's something like adhering to a injury rehab program is going to be really important. A lot of times when athletes return from injury, there are some limitations, or at least perceived limitations, So if you stick to a plan, then that usually is a form of coping with those limitations, because you at least are following someone's specific program to help you deal with the stress, the physical stress of injury or rehab. And it's usually, I mean, of course, it will be prescribed by some type of professional. Emotion focus, coping, some skills that we might use here are things like meditation, relaxation. Wishful thinking helps to some degree, right? So instead of focusing on the negatives, really try to be extremely positive about things. But again, being realistic is key there. Reappraisals is important, so instead of going with that initial appraisal, kind of like a first impression, trying to think a little bit further through an issue that you might be going through to, again, just reappraise a stressor or an event. Should it be causing this much stress? Then there are some maladaptive, so some maybe not the best forms of ways to cope with our emotions in sport, such as like self-blame. So instead of being really angry, we blame ourselves. And then there's things like mental or behavioral withdrawal, where we literally just kind of shut down. And that's not helping us deal with the feelings that we're encountering. Instead, it's just a way of not dealing with them, which ultimately doesn't solve the problem, and it could be a persistent form of stress later on. And then there's also cognitive efforts to change the meaning of the situation. But of course, with this, you're not actually changing the problem. You're not actually changing the environment. You're just trying to play down the importance or whatever is causing the stress. Okay, so with this, when you can kind of encapsulate this into two take-homes, right? So using problem-focused coping is something we'll generally do when a situation can be changed, so the actual elements of the situation can be changed. Such as if you find that you become extremely anxious when working out in a gym that's populated by a lot of people, you could try and actually change the time that you go work out to a time when the gym's not busy. So something like that. That's not a great example, but it's just something where we can literally change the situation. And then emotion-focused coping, we're going to use that in situations where we really can't change the situation, right? So if we become anxious about taking a free throw shot at a basketball game, a high school basketball game, there's going to be people there watching. There's going to be cheering. There's going to be noise. So we use emotion-focused coping to try and deal with this unchangeable situation. So with coping, we should also talk about resiliency, or this idea of bouncing back. Because a lot of times, even though we're put in a situation we try to cope, we don't always still perform well, okay? So resiliency is this idea of learning from our mistakes and bouncing back. So clearly this is a related topic to coping, just as it says here. So if someone's hurt, they'll want to work on these resiliency skills. Poor performances, of course, we want athletes to bounce back, that kind of things. So a big thing here is the second point, where it just says many individuals not only survive, but gain a positive attribute or experience because of adversity. So sometimes because we go through something, go through an event where we don't perform well, where we get cut, a lot of times people learn a great deal about themselves, the sport experience, and even how they deal with stressful situations just by going through some adversity. So that's something to keep in mind as well. What else do we have here? There's also the elements of mental toughness or personal resources. Of course, these are going to be extremely important for someone who's resilient and trying to cope with adversity. But we should also note that one big influence with this resiliency idea is this idea of support or social support. and like it says here, even the lack of social support. And the thinking here is if we have a lot of social support, maybe coming from multiple people, then we're more likely to have more personal resources, right? We're going to have someone who pushes us, who motivates us to get back into sport or into an activity program. But if an individual is all alone and they face adversity and they don't have any sources of support, then really they might be at a disadvantage, right? Because they don't have someone there to help them persevere through this negative experience. A big take home here, though, is really there's no one coping strategy that's going to work best. They're not all great for all situations, and I kind of mentioned this in the previous lecture, but everybody's going to be different, and the skills that they use should be tailored to the individual. Okay? Thinking about time is important too. Sometimes people will talk about active coping. That's just problem-focused coping, and avoidance or withdrawal coping. So if you think about those, problem-focused or avoidance, yeah, in the short term, they can be helpful in reducing some stress. But when we look across the long term, we tend to see that, yeah, active coping or problem-focused and emotion-focused coping do help in the short term, or in the long term, as long as you're persistent and that kind of thing. But avoidance, as I mentioned before, doesn't really help. It has a negative relationship with some what we might consider positive outcomes of sport, like enjoyment, adherence, and that kind of stuff. And that's because they're not really dealing with the stress or trying to cope with it. They're just literally avoiding it. There's also a couple other little nuts and bolts here. So gender, age, puberty, those kind of things can influence the type of coping strategies that individuals will use, and also their perceived effectiveness. So younger kids have trouble using emotion-focused coping because that's more of an advanced form of coping. You have to be very self-aware. But then there's also elements such as males tend to utilize problem-focused coping strategies a lot more than women, and women tend to use emotion-focused a lot more. But at the same time, women tend to seek out social support and use that as a form of coping more often than men do. Okay. The next point here is pretty straightforward. Coping appears to be situation specific, and that's because every situation is going to cause different stressors. Excuse me. And the last point here, again, I said this before, but there's a lot of differences in the coping strategies that we're going to talk about in a second. So the goal is really working with an athlete to figure out which ones work best for them. So let's talk about coping with emotions, because those tend to be kind of the trickier ones. There's self-statement modification. I call this reframing. So basically taking a negative thought and turning it into a positive one, or instead of focusing on a negative, focus on a positive. Imagery is helpful, so it allows you to cope with negative emotions, or sometimes it even reminds you of those positive emotions and why you're playing a sport or in a certain situation. There's Socratic dialogue. This one's a little bit tricky, and you could see why younger kids wouldn't be very good at this, but it's where you're asking yourself some tough questions, some of those deep thinkers, okay? And the goal is to pose questions that really get the athlete to reevaluate any self-defeating thought that they might have. There's also corrective experiences, so this is where the athlete actually goes out and tries to engage in the behavior that's stressing them out. And the idea here is it's kind of like inoculation, where you're exposing yourself to it multiple times. Excuse me. But it also gives you the opportunity to try and correct the mistakes that you performed previously. Another one is the modeling process. So the idea here is vicarious learning. So by watching others go through a similar situation, you might be able to learn from another person's performance. And then there's self-analysis. So the idea here is kind of having like a personal journal or diary to monitor your emotions in sport. This is going to increase your self-awareness and also allow you to really figure out what works best for you. Sometimes storytelling, metaphors, poetry is just another good way of processing the emotions and feelings that you're going through after some event. Also, those kind of things, these kind of outlets allow you to think of viewing situations differently. Usually, there's a creative element here. And then this last one is reframing. So this one's, again, a little bit different in how they pose it. I've always thought of reframing, as I said earlier, changing the thoughts that you're having, but we can also think about it as perspective taking, which involves viewing an important competition as just another game. So again, it's taking the situation and just changing how you're thinking about it. So instead of this being a Michigan State football game, it's just another practice, because really there shouldn't be, the skills that are being engaged in shouldn't be that different from what you're doing in practice. And then there's always the need to generalize our coping skills. Okay, and what needs to be known here is coping skills shouldn't just be used in sport. They can be used in all different kinds of life situations. And some are going to go beyond sport and physical activity. Just really the goal here is thinking about what are other ways where you could practice or engage in these coping strategies, so that way you figure out what works best for you. And a lot of times this stuff will work great in other other environments, such as work environments. There's also, I'm kind of beating a dead horse here with these bullets, but really there needs to be some personal significance of the coping application. So having some buy-in from the athlete, getting them to recognize that these coping skills are important to an individual, and if they get that, then they're more likely to transfer the coping skills elsewhere. But also, if someone has a great coping skill maybe in their work environment that they use to deal with stressful events, if they really buy into that and believe that coping skill is important, there's a chance they could try and bring that into sport. And then the last point here is this internal locus of control, which is always important. The person, an individual or an athlete who believes that they're in control of their coping skill, they have this idea of ownership of it, again, is more likely to transfer that skill to other domains. And again, this last one here might be a bit implied from what we've already covered, but resourceful individuals are more likely to apply their skills elsewhere. So someone who's able to recognize alternative sources of social support, alternative ways to approach a situation, figuring out ways to change their thinking or reframing an event, is probably someone who's going to be able to utilize coping skills in a lot of different domains. Okay, now this is actually the end of this lecture, which works out well because my computer was about to die. So this is the end of the lecture for Chapter 12 with arousal regulation and this coping component. So make sure you go ahead and do the 4-point activity before you move on to the next chapter. Thanks, guys.